Imagine a moment of solitude, a quiet evening where everything seems calm, but deep within, there's an unsettling restlessness. You feel it gnawing at you, something invisible yet powerful. It's a weight you carry, a secret battle that no one else seems to notice. You go about your daily routine, smile at people, and maybe even pray, but deep down, you sense that something is terribly wrong. You try to convince yourself it's not a big deal. Everyone does it, you think. It's harmless. But is it? What if I told you that this battle is costing you more than you realize? Not just emotionally, but spiritually. What if the choices you're making in those quiet, hidden moments are building chains around your soul, locking you away from peace, joy, and even your purpose in life? The truth is, these choices are not just habits. They're traps, crafted to pull you further and further from the light. And here's the chilling part. You may not even see the full extent of the danger until it's too late. Padre Pio, a man known for his profound spiritual wisdom and his tireless fight against sin, once said that many people live their lives unaware of the spiritual warfare raging around them. He called it a macabre dance, a dark seduction that lures souls away from God under the guise of pleasure and comfort. Are you unknowingly part of that dance? There's a reason you're here, watching this video right now. Something in your heart is searching for answers, for hope, for a way out. Deep down, you know you were made for more than this. But how do you break free? How do you reclaim your spiritual strength and live a life of peace and purpose? You may feel alone in this struggle, but let me assure you, you're not. Thousands, even millions, are fighting this same battle. And the good news? Victory is possible. It's not easy, but it is possible. And it doesn't require you to be perfect. It only requires you to be willing to take the first step. In this video, we'll uncover the real impact of the choices you're making. Choices that may seem small, but have eternal consequences. You'll see how these choices are shaping your soul, your mind, and even your destiny. More importantly, we'll explore how to turn it all around. Because no matter how far you've fallen, there's a way back, and you don't have to figure it out alone. So, are you ready to face the truth? Are you ready to take control of your spiritual life and discover the freedom and peace that have been waiting for you all along? Stick with me. And by the end of this video, you'll understand the hidden dangers and the simple, powerful steps you can take to overcome them once and for all. If you find yourself relating to this, if something in your heart is stirring, take a moment to hit the subscribe button. Here, we uncover the hidden battles of the soul, guided by the wisdom of the saints, to help you live a life of true freedom. Don't miss what's coming next. This could be the moment that changes everything. Andrew had always been a curious child, as most children are. His life, from the outside, appeared to be typical, even ideal. He had loving parents who taught him the values of love, respect, and purity. They were devout Catholics, and they made sure that Andrew and his siblings grew up with a deep understanding of the importance of faith and virtuous living. They attended Mass every Sunday, said their prayers together, and their home was filled with the warmth of family devotion. But, as he would later come to realize, something was missing, something he couldn't put into words at the time. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon when Andrew was first introduced to a world he didn't understand. He was only 10 years old. He and his friends were playing in the neighborhood, as children often do, when one of them pulled out an old magazine they had found in an abandoned house nearby. It was covered with a tattered plastic wrapper, but that didn't stop Andrew's curiosity from peaking. It wasn't a magazine like any he had ever seen before, and as he flipped through its pages, a sense of confusion settled in his heart. The images were foreign, almost surreal to his innocent mind. They showed intimacy in a way that felt both strange and fascinating at the same time. The idea of love, purity, and respect that had been instilled in him by his parents seemed distant, almost irrelevant in that moment. His mind was racing. He didn't know what to make of what he was seeing, but it stirred something inside of him, something he couldn't explain. Andrew didn't fully understand the weight of what he had just encountered. In his mind, it was simply a curious discovery. But the more he thought about it, the more his thoughts began to linger on those images. What were they? Why did they make him feel a strange mixture of excitement and shame? As the days passed, he couldn't seem to shake off the images from his mind. They became a secret obsession, buried deep within him. From that point on, Andrew's life began to shift. At first, it was just a fleeting curiosity. But over time, the desire to see more grew stronger. It wasn't just about the images themselves, it was about the mystery they represented. There was something about the forbidden nature of it all that drew him in. Every time he thought he could forget, the images would return to his mind, demanding his attention. Andrew's parents continued to teach him the values of love, respect, and purity. But in the secret recesses of his heart, Andrew had begun to wrestle with something darker. He wasn't consciously aware of it yet, but the foundation of his purity had started to crack, and he didn't know how to repair it. In his quiet moments, Andrew began to notice the growing emptiness inside him.
He had always been an energetic child, active in sports and games, loved by his friends and family. But now there were days when he felt disconnected, almost as if he were a spectator in his own life. He smiled and laughed with his friends,
Played his favorite video games, and joined in on family dinners, but there was always this nagging emptiness. It wasn't that Andrew didn't feel loved. It was something deeper, something intangible. A desire for something more, something that the world couldn't seem to offer. As the years went on, Andrew's secret battle continued. The images, once just a fleeting curiosity, began to turn into something much more. He didn't talk about it to anyone, not even to his closest friends. He didn't know how. After all, he had been taught that these thoughts, these desires, were wrong. They didn't align with the faith he had been raised with. So, he buried them deep inside, convincing himself that he was just going through a phase, that it would pass. But it didn't. The emptiness in Andrew's heart was growing. No matter how hard he tried to distract himself, the pull of temptation was stronger. The addiction to pornography had taken root in his soul. It wasn't just an occasional curiosity anymore. It had become a habit, a craving, an ever-present force that seemed to consume him from the inside out. At times, he would hear his parents talking about the importance of chastity, of saving oneself for marriage, and he would feel a pang of guilt. He knew what they were teaching him was right. He understood the importance of purity, but in the depths of his soul, he felt helpless. How could he reconcile the two worlds, the one his parents had taught him, and the one he had found on his own? He felt like he was living a double life, one where he smiled in front of others and pretended that everything was fine, while secretly, he struggled with his secret addiction. The shame was suffocating. But the deeper Andrew fell into his secret world, the harder it became to break free. He wanted to stop, but he couldn't. The cravings became more intense, more overwhelming. And the emptiness, it never seemed to go away. This inner turmoil, this struggle between what he knew was right and the constant pull of temptation, began to affect every part of Andrew's life. His relationships with his family became strained. He felt increasingly distant from them, unable to connect the way he once had. He was becoming someone he didn't recognize, and it scared him. The boy who had once been full of life and joy now felt lost in a dark, secret world. But Andrew wasn't ready to give up just yet. Deep down, he still held on to the hope that things could get better, that he could escape the grip of this addiction. But he didn't know how. His heart longed for something more, something real, something pure, but he couldn't see the way forward. In moments of quiet, when he was alone with his thoughts, Andrew couldn't help but wonder, is there any hope for me? Can I truly be free from this darkness? As the years passed, Andrew's life seemed to unfold like any other young man's. He grew taller, more confident, and his interests matured. He continued to live under the roof of his loving parents, who still imparted the lessons of faith, love, and purity that they had always taught him. However, beneath the surface of his seemingly perfect life, there was an invisible struggle brewing, one that he kept hidden from the world. The struggle was not something that was apparent to those around him. To his family, friends, and peers, Andrew was just like any other young man, striving to balance his faith with his growing sense of independence. But as Andrew's body matured, so did his desires. He began to notice changes within himself, changes that made him feel both excited and confused. The curiosity he had felt as a child when he had first discovered those strange images in a forgotten magazine had not disappeared. In fact, it had grown stronger. At first it was innocent, just fleeting thoughts that crossed his mind when he was alone, things that felt strange but exciting. It was natural to be curious, after all, but what Andrew didn't realize at the time was that those fleeting thoughts, that curiosity, would soon become a dangerous obsession. It was an afternoon like any other when Andrew first encountered the full force of what he had only glimpsed as a child. He was alone in his room, scrolling aimlessly through the internet, when he stumbled upon something that would pull him deeper into the web of sin. At first, he didn't know what to make of it. The images were vivid, and the feelings they stirred within him were unfamiliar and intoxicating. It was as if his body and mind were responding to a call he couldn't ignore. He had no idea that in that moment, he was taking the first step down a dark path, a path that would lead him to the very heart of his struggle. Andrew didn't intend for it to become a habit. He told himself that it was just curiosity, just a passing thing. It didn't mean anything. It wasn't a big deal. But over time, it became more than just a fleeting indulgence. The images, once rare and exciting, began to appear more frequently in his mind. The cravings grew stronger, more demanding. It wasn't long before they controlled him. What started as something innocent, something that seemed harmless, became an addiction. The guilt was overwhelming. Every time he gave in, every time he indulged in this new obsession, the shame would settle in. It was a deep, gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach that wouldn't go away. Andrew knew what he was doing was wrong. He had been raised with a strong moral compass. His parents had instilled in him the importance of purity, love, and respect. He knew the teachings of the church. He knew that this wasn't how God intended relationships or intimacy to be, and yet despite all of that knowledge, he couldn't stop himself. The cravings were too strong, the pull too powerful. He felt trapped, as if he were in a cage he couldn't escape. Andrew tried to justify it in his mind. He convinced himself that it was just a natural part of growing up, that it wasn't harming anyone. He told himself that it was just something people did, something everyone did. He wasn't the only one, after all. Everyone around him seemed to be engaging with the same things, so why should he be different? He pushed the guilt aside, choosing to ignore the voice inside him that called out for repentance and change. But deep down, he knew. He knew that he was doing something that was breaking him inside. He knew that every time he indulged in his secret habit, he was drifting further away from the person he wanted to be. The void he was trying to fill with these fleeting moments of pleasure only seemed to grow larger. The emptiness didn't go away. It never went away. It was a vicious cycle. Every time Andrew gave in, he felt a brief sense of satisfaction, like a quick fix to a deep wound. But that satisfaction never lasted. Soon the guilt and shame would return, and he would find himself trapped again. The loneliness grew more intense, as did the sense that he was living a double life. He couldn't share his struggle with anyone, not his parents, not his friends, not even his church. He was afraid that if anyone knew the truth, they would be disappointed in him. He feared that his sin would be exposed, that he would be cast out, left alone to face the consequences of his actions. So he kept it all hidden, locked away in the darkest corners of his mind. But the isolation didn't stop there. As time went on, Andrew became more and more withdrawn. He started pulling away from his family and friends. The person he had once been, the vibrant, curious, joyful young man, seemed to disappear. He found himself caught in a never-ending cycle of self-loathing and shame. It was as if he were living two separate lives, one in the public eye, where he wore a mask of normalcy, and the other hidden away in the shadows, where he fought his inner demons. He wanted to break free. He longed to stop. He hated what he had become. But every time he tried to resist, the pull of temptation was too great. He would promise himself that he would stop, that tomorrow would be different, but tomorrow always came with the same patterns. Every time, He felt like a failure, like he wasn't strong enough to control his desires. It was as if he were powerless against the forces that were at work within him. And yet through all of this, there was a faint, flickering hope deep inside Andrew. He remembered the teachings of his childhood, the lessons of purity and respect that had been instilled in him. He knew what was right. He knew the path he should be walking, but he couldn't see a way forward. Every attempt to break free felt like it ended in failure, leaving him with the same feeling of emptiness and defeat. It was in these moments of desperation that Andrew began to reflect on the words of his parents, his priests, and the saints. He thought back to the stories of people like Saint Padre Pio, who had fought their own battles against temptation and sin. He wondered how they had overcome their struggles. How had they found the strength to resist the darkness that threatened to consume them? Andrew began to realize something. He wasn't the only one who had struggled. He wasn't alone. And maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. But for now, he was still stuck in that place. The place of guilt, shame, and isolation. The place where the silence of his struggle echoed louder than the voice of hope. The place where the first steps down the path of sin had led him to a place of deep despair. Andrew's descent into addiction didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic event that changed the course of his life. It was a slow, insidious process that crept into his soul, almost imperceptibly, and took root in the deepest parts of his heart. At first, it was just a curiosity, a secret indulgence he justified with the rationale that everyone was doing it, that it didn't really matter. But, as time went on, the initial innocence of it all faded, and a new, darker reality began to take shape. He had told himself that what he was doing wasn't a big deal. He wasn't hurting anyone. It was just an escape, a way to feel a sense of pleasure and relief from the constant emptiness he felt inside. No one knew about it, and that meant it didn't have to be a problem. After all, who was he really hurting? It wasn't like anyone could see what he was doing in the privacy of his own room. It was his life, his choices, and no one else's business, right? But the lie that he told himself was slowly eating away at him. The more he gave in to his addiction, the more disconnected he became from everything that once mattered to him. It started with small changes, tiny cracks in his spiritual life that he barely noticed. The occasional prayer that he skipped because he didn't have time, the moments when he chose not to attend Mass because he felt too tired, too distracted by his desires. Soon, these moments became habits. His faith, something that had once been the center of his life, began to fade into the background. Andrew couldn't see it at first. He had convinced himself that he was still in control. After all, he wasn't hurting anyone, and he wasn't doing anything wrong, at least not in the way he thought he was. He still believed in God. He still went to church when he could. He was still a good person, right? But there was a subtle shift happening inside of him, a shift that he didn't want to acknowledge. The lie he was telling himself, the lie that pornography was harmless and that he could control it, was a dangerous one. The more he fed into it, the more his life began to spiral out of control. He became more isolated. He began to feel distant from his family, unable to connect with them on a deeper level. He still loved them, but the bond that had once been so strong was now strained by the secret that he carried with him, a secret that he couldn't share, couldn't explain. He had become a prisoner of his own desires, locked away in a cage of shame and guilt that he couldn't escape from. The darkness of addiction slowly crept into his relationships, distorting his view of love and intimacy. What had once been pure and sacred, his understanding of love, the way he viewed relationships, was now tainted by the distorted images he consumed. The idea of true intimacy, of real love, seemed distant. His perception of women, of his own worth, became twisted. Instead of seeing relationships as an opportunity for mutual respect, trust, and love, Andrew began to see them through the lens of his addiction, a lens that was distorted and unhealthy. The lie of freedom, the lie that pornography was harmless, had become a cage. But Andrew didn't see it yet. He was too deep in the darkness to recognize that the very thing he thought was giving him freedom was actually enslaving him. Every Time he indulged, every time he gave in to the temptation, he felt a brief sense of relief. It was as if the pain of emptiness inside him was temporarily numbed. But as soon as the pleasure faded, the shame would return, and the cycle would repeat itself. This spiritual blindness, this lie of freedom, was the most dangerous part of Andrew's addiction. He couldn't see how far he had fallen, how much his addiction had distorted his mind and heart. He had believed the lie that it was harmless, that it wasn't affecting his relationships or his faith. But in truth, it was doing exactly that. It was slowly chipping away at the foundation of his life, pulling him further and further away from the person he wanted to be. The more he gave in to the temptation, the more his self-worth deteriorated. The more he believed the lie that it wasn't hurting anyone, the more he hurt himself. Andrew's life began to feel like a balancing act. On one hand, he had his faith, his family, his friends, everything that had once been important to him. On the other hand, he had his secret addiction, something that he couldn't talk about, couldn't share with anyone. The weight of it all was heavy. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw a man who had been lost to his desires. He saw someone who had lost touch with the person he used to be, the person he wanted to become. His addiction was eating away at him, but the worst part was that he couldn't see a way out. Every time he tried to break free, he found himself drawn back in. The cravings were too powerful, the temptation too strong. He felt like a slave to his desires, trapped in a never-ending cycle of indulgence and regret. And the more he indulged, the more disconnected he felt from God, from his family, from himself. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but he couldn't stop. But the truth, as Andrew would come to learn, was that he wasn't free at all. He had been living a lie. The freedom he thought he was experiencing was nothing more than a mirage. It was a deception that kept him trapped, isolated, and enslaved. The real freedom, the true freedom, was not found in indulgence. It wasn't found in giving in to his desires or seeking temporary pleasure. True freedom, as he would later realize, was found in overcoming the darkness, in confronting his addiction, and in choosing a path of healing and restoration. For now, though, Andrew couldn't see that. He was still blinded by the lie that pornography wasn't hurting him. He was still trapped in the cycle of addiction, unable to break free. The darkness had clouded his judgment, distorted his view of love and relationships, and left him feeling more alone than ever before. His faith had become an afterthought, something he practiced out of habit, not out of a true connection with God. The lie of freedom had led him into spiritual blindness, and he didn't know how to escape. But deep down, in the quietest corners of his heart, Andrew knew that he couldn't keep living this way. He knew that there had to be more to life than this, more to love, more to relationships, more to faith. But the path forward seemed unclear, and the darkness that surrounded him felt all-encompassing. Andrew's life had become a blur of confusion and pain. The lies, the guilt, and the shame all seemed to weigh him down, pulling him into a darkness that was difficult to escape. He felt lost, disconnected from the life he once knew, and overwhelmed by his addiction. Every day seemed like a battle, but the worst part was that he didn't know how to fight it anymore. The addiction, the temptation, it had become a force in his life that he couldn't control, a force that made him question his own worth. He was trapped in a cycle of self-doubt, consumed by his struggles. But one day, something happened that would change everything. It wasn't a grand, dramatic moment of clarity or a miraculous intervention. It was a quiet, almost serendipitous moment, as if the universe had nudged him towards something greater. As he walked through his local bookstore, his eyes landed on a book with a picture of a man on the cover, a man whose eyes seemed to hold a wisdom that drew him in. The book was about the life of Saint Padre Pio, a Catholic priest who had faced incredible temptations and struggles throughout his own life. He was known for his intense faith, his deep commitment to God, and his incredible ability to endure suffering with grace. At first, Andrew was hesitant. He had never been one to read religious books, not in the way that others did, but there was something about this one, something that seemed to beckon him, something he couldn't ignore. Without thinking, he picked it up and began to read. Pages described how Padre Pio had struggled with temptations throughout his life, battling forces that sought to undermine his soul. The more Andrew read, the more he saw parallels between Padre Pio's struggles and his own. Padre Pio was not a man free from temptation. He was a man who fought against it every single day. Yet, despite the many trials and challenges he faced, Padre Pio remained steadfast in his faith. He didn't give in to the temptation of despair or the allure of sin. Instead, he turned to prayer, to the sacraments, and to God's strength in his moments of weakness. The more Andrew read, the more he felt a stirring in his heart. There was a sense of hope that began to rise within him, a hope that he had been missing for so long. If Padre Pio could face such incredible challenges and remain faithful, then maybe, just maybe, Andrew could overcome his own struggles. Maybe he could fight the temptation, break free from the addiction that had held him captive for so long. The idea seemed almost too simple to be true. After all, Andrew had tried everything. He had tried to fight on his own, tried to break free from his addiction with sheer willpower, but every time he failed. The temptation was too strong, the addiction too ingrained. He had felt hopeless, trapped, unable to move forward. But as he read about Padre Pio, he realized that the key wasn't in fighting alone. The key was turning to God, leaning on his strength and trusting in his mercy. Padre Pio had done this, and so could he. It was in that moment that Andrew experienced something he hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. A light bulb went off in his mind. The darkness that had consumed him for so long seemed to lift, even if only for a brief moment. He understood that his battle wasn't just about resisting temptation, it was about surrendering to God, allowing His grace to guide him through his struggles. Andrew closed the book, his heart racing with a newfound sense of purpose. He knew that he couldn't continue down the path he had been walking. He couldn't keep living the lie that had trapped him for so long. But the path forward was no longer unclear. It wasn't about achieving perfection, because he knew that would never happen. It was about progress, about choosing to take one step at a time, about choosing to lean on God's strength instead of his own. And if Padre Pio could do it, so could he. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew that. Breaking free from an addiction, from a cycle of temptation and guilt, was never easy. But for the first time in a long time, Andrew felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone in this battle. God was with him, and if Padre Pio could overcome his struggles, then perhaps he could too. Andrew's transformation didn't happen overnight, but that moment, when he read about Padre Pio's unwavering faith, was the turning point. It was the spark that ignited the fire of change in his heart. From that day forward, he knew he had to take action. He had to make changes in his life, no matter how small. He had to start praying, even when he didn't feel like it. He had to start going to Mass, even when the temptation to stay home was strong. He had to be honest with himself, with his faith, and with those around him. But most importantly, he had to remember that he wasn't alone. He had to lean on God's strength in his moments of weakness, just as Padre Pio had done. That was the key to overcoming the darkness that had once consumed him, the key to finding the freedom he had been searching for all along. As Andrew reflected on the life of Saint Padre Pio, he began to see the world in a new light. He realized that his struggles weren't unique. Everyone faces temptation. Everyone struggles with something. But the key was not in giving in to those struggles. It was in how he responded to them. If he wanted to change, he had to make a choice to surrender to God and trust in His grace. And that choice, while difficult, would lead him down the path to healing. He didn't know where the journey would take him. He didn't know how long it would take to break free from the addiction. But he knew one thing. He was no longer walking that path alone. God was with him, and He would help him find his way back to the light. Andrew's journey towards overcoming his struggles was not an easy one. Like so many people dealing with deep personal battles, the road to recovery required a combination of commitment, humility, and faith. But what separated his journey from Others was his conscious decision to confront the darkness head-on with the tools of faith that had been so beautifully modeled by figures like Padre Pio. Breaking free from any addiction, especially something as pervasive and culturally ingrained as pornography, requires more than just willpower. It requires a full transformation, not just of habits, but of the heart, mind, and soul. For Andrew, it meant embracing the foundational truths of his Catholic faith, leaning on the strength of God, and allowing others into his journey, something that had always been difficult for him. One of the most pivotal moments of his recovery happened when he stopped running from his shame and admitted his struggle. For years, Andrew had been avoiding the sacrament of reconciliation, the very sacrament that would allow him to confront his sins and start anew. The shame he carried from his secret addiction made it feel impossible to approach the confessional. He believed that his sin was too great, that God could never forgive him for the things he had done in secret. The guilt had clouded his heart and mind, leading him to the false belief that his actions had permanently severed his connection to God. But it was in the depths of his despair that Andrew realized how much he was missing by avoiding the sacrament. The sacrament of reconciliation wasn't about condemnation. It was about healing. It wasn't about running away from sin. It was about coming face to face with it and finding freedom. And so, Andrew took the first step in his transformation. He went to confession, confessing the depth of his struggles and his sins with a broken heart, but also a sincere desire to change. The moment he entered the confessional, something shifted within him. The weight that had been pressing on his soul for so long began to lighten, and for the first time in years, Andrew felt the warmth of God's love and mercy wash over him. He realized that God was not waiting to punish him. He was waiting to heal him. Through the words of absolution from the priest, Andrew felt freed from the chains that had bound him. It wasn't just about forgiveness. It was about the renewal of his spirit. But just because Andrew had taken the step to confess didn't mean the battle was over. He knew that overcoming his addiction would require more than one encounter with God's mercy. It would require persistent effort, daily prayer, and radical changes in his life. His addiction had not only affected his relationship with God, it had also affected his relationship with himself and others. To truly change, Andrew had to rebuild the foundations of his spiritual life, the ones that had been eroded by years of sin and neglect. Inspired by the life of Padre Pio, whose own commitment to prayer was unwavering even in the face of temptation, Andrew began to pray daily. At first, his prayers were simple, asking God for strength, for courage, and for help to resist the temptations that seemed so constant. But over time, his prayer life deepened. He found himself speaking more openly with God, sharing his fears, his doubts, and his desires for healing. Prayer became his anchor, a lifeline that connected him to God's strength in his moments of weakness. Andrew also understood that healing didn't happen in isolation. He needed support from others who could walk alongside him in his journey. That's when he sought out a support group at his church. He had always been a person who kept his struggles to himself, fearful of judgment or rejection. But he realized that in order to heal, he had to be vulnerable. He needed to open up about his struggles and allow others to help him carry the burden. In the support group, he found understanding, compassion, and accountability. It was a group of people who knew the pain of addiction, who understood the struggle and the shame that came with it, and who offered each other grace and encouragement as they worked through their battles together. The process of recovery for Andrew was not immediate. There were times when he stumbled and moments when he felt like giving up. But instead of letting those moments define him, he allowed them to serve as opportunities for growth. Each time he fell, he returned to the sacraments, renewed his commitment to prayer, and sought guidance from those who cared for him. Through these actions, Andrew began to see real changes in his life. One of the most significant changes was how he began to fill his mind with positive, edifying content. He realized that one of the reasons his addiction had taken root in his life was because he had been feeding his mind with toxic, harmful material, images and ideas that distorted his view of love, intimacy, and respect. To counteract this, Andrew started immersing himself in scripture and reading books that aligned with his values. He also made a concerted effort to spend more time with people who uplifted him, people whose lives reflected the love of Christ. These small, consistent changes in his environment began to shift his perspective and strengthen his resolve. Andrew's journey was not without setbacks. But with each setback, he grew stronger. Each time he faced temptation, he turned to prayer. Each time he felt isolated or discouraged, he reached out to his support group. And through it all, he found that the grip of pornography, once a powerful force in his life, began to loosen. Slowly but surely, he was regaining control of his thoughts, his heart, and his life. His soul started to heal, piece by piece, as he chose to embrace the tools of faith that had been offered to him all along. Prayer, the sacraments, scripture, and the support of others. It wasn't easy and it wasn't quick, but Andrew's journey was a testament to the power of perseverance, faith, and God's mercy. Months passed, and the change in Andrew's life was undeniable. He looked back at the path he had walked, one filled with struggles, temptations, guilt, and loneliness, and realized that he was no longer enslaved by the very thing that had held him captive for so long. The chains of addiction had been broken, and while the road had been long and painful, he had emerged from it with a newfound sense of peace and purpose. For so long, Andrew had been trapped in the cycle of fleeting pleasure and shame, believing that indulging in his desires would give him the satisfaction he craved. But the reality of his addiction had taught him a powerful lesson. True freedom and fulfillment didn't come from satisfying those desires. It came from surrendering his will to God, aligning his life with his purpose, and living in accordance with his love. The temptations were still there, just as they had been before. But now, Andrew had the tools to fight back. He had learned to rely on his relationship with God, a relationship that had deepened and grown through the struggles. His commitment to prayer had become his greatest weapon in the battle, and each prayer brought him closer to the strength and peace he needed to overcome temptation. He no longer faced his struggles alone. He had a community of support that surrounded him, people who held him accountable, prayed for him, and encouraged him to keep going. Andrew had also come to understand the importance of filling his mind and heart with positive influences. He had replaced the destructive content that once filled his thoughts with things that uplifted and edified him. He spent more time in Scripture, immersing himself in the Word of God, and allowed the truths of the Bible to reshape his understanding of love, relationships, and his identity in Christ. He filled his life with joy, purpose, and purity, knowing that these things were the fruits of a life aligned with God's will. Looking to Padre Pio for inspiration had been a turning point for Andrew. The saint's unwavering commitment to prayer, his perseverance in the face of temptation, and his reliance on God's grace had become a blueprint for Andrew's own journey. Padre Pio's life had shown him that true freedom was not found in self-indulgence, but in surrendering to God's plan for his life. Andrew saw how Padre Pio had faced immense struggles and temptations throughout his own life, yet had remained steadfast in his faith. And if Padre Pio could do it, then so could he. There were times when the temptation still seemed to whisper in the back of his mind, moments when the old habits and cravings threatened to resurface. But Andrew had learned to recognize these moments for what they were: fleeting temptations, empty promises of satisfaction that would ultimately leave him feeling more empty than before. He had learned that true peace did not come from indulging in these desires. It came from living a life in communion with God, from surrendering his heart and will to Him, and from choosing purity over pleasure. One of the most powerful realizations Andrew had was that the joy and peace he had been seeking in pornography had always been available to him in God. It wasn't something that needed to be earned or attained through self-gratification. It was a gift that had always been there, waiting for him to receive it. Through prayer, the sacraments, and his commitment to a life of purity, Andrew found the peace that had long eluded him. His relationships too began to change. The disconnection and isolation he had once felt started to fade as he embraced the love of God and the support of his community. He became more present with his family, more engaged with his friends, and more open to forming meaningful, authentic connections with others. He realized that his addiction had kept him from fully experiencing the love and joy that comes from healthy, Christ-centered relationships. But now, as he walked in the freedom that came from purity, he was able to love and be loved in a way he had never experienced before. Andrew also found that his understanding of intimacy had changed. He no longer viewed it through the lens of selfish desire or temporary pleasure. Instead, he saw it as a beautiful gift, something sacred, meant to be shared within the context of love, commitment, and mutual respect. The healing and transformation that had taken place in his own heart allowed him to see others in a new light, with love and compassion rather than objectification or lust. As the months turned into years, Andrew continued to grow in his faith, his relationships, and his understanding of himself. He no longer struggled with the same temptations that had once held him captive, but he remained vigilant, always aware of the need to stay grounded in his relationship with God. His life was no longer defined by addiction, guilt, or shame. It was defined by purity, peace, and joy. And through it all, he never forgot the lessons he had learned along the way. That true freedom doesn't come from indulgence, but from surrender. That peace isn't found in fleeting pleasures, but in aligning your life with God's will. And that the battle is worth it, the battle for purity, for peace, and for a life centered in God. Andrew's victory wasn't just about overcoming pornography. It was about rediscovering who he was in God, reclaiming his dignity and worth, and learning to live a life that reflected the love and grace of God. It was a victory that had been won through persistence, prayer, community, and the power of God's transforming love. And as he looked back on his journey, he knew that he was no longer the person he once was. He had been made new. As we reach the end of this journey, I want to take a moment to recap everything we've covered together. Over the past moments, we've followed Andrew's journey of transformation. What began as an innocent curiosity, an exploration of desires, spiraled into an addiction that nearly consumed him. We witnessed how pornography, in its deceptive promise of freedom and fulfillment, entangled him in guilt, shame, and isolation. The lie that it was harmless left him spiritually blind and disconnected from everything he once held dear, his faith, his family, and ultimately, his own sense of self-worth. But then, something changed. It wasn't overnight. It wasn't a magic fix. It was a process, a long and challenging one, filled with moments of struggle, self-reflection, and prayer. Andrew's awakening came when he stumbled upon the life of Saint Padre Pio, a man who, like him, had battled temptation, faced immense struggles, and found the strength to overcome it. Inspired by Padre Pio's unwavering faith and perseverance in prayer, Andrew found the courage to step into the light, to admit his weaknesses, and to seek God's help in his battle for purity. The transformation didn't happen all at once, but with every prayer, every sacrament, and every step toward accountability, Andrew began to break free from the chains of addiction. He surrounded himself with a community of support, filled his mind with positive influences, and most importantly, committed himself to a deeper relationship with God. It was in this commitment that he discovered what true freedom looked like. It wasn't found in indulgence, but in surrender to God's will. It wasn't about satisfying fleeting desires, but about aligning his life with love, purity, and purpose. And as we saw in the final part of Andrew's journey, he didn't just overcome pornography. He reclaimed his life. His relationships healed. His heart was restored. His faith deepened. His life became filled with the peace, joy, and purpose that only a life centered on God can bring. Andrew's victory wasn't about willpower alone. It was about the grace of God, the strength of community, and the power of transformation that comes when we turn our lives over to God. But this story doesn't end with Andrew. This is a story that could belong to any one of us. In fact, it might be your story. The struggles, the temptations, the desire for freedom, they are not unique to Andrew alone. Many of us face battles with addiction, with guilt, with the desire to escape. Many of us struggle with the emptiness that pornography or other vices promise to fill. But the truth is, we don't have to stay stuck in that cycle. There is hope. There is a way out, and that way is through Christ. If you've found yourself relating to Andrew's story, if you've been battling your own temptations, or if you simply want to strengthen your relationship with God and find peace in your life, I encourage you to take the next step. Don't just stop here. There is so much more available to you, and I have a playlist filled with videos that will help guide you in this journey. In these videos, you'll find more stories of hope, more teachings on how to overcome the challenges of sin, and more tools to help you live a life of purity, peace, and purpose. These aren't just videos, they're an invitation to transform your life, to leave behind the chains that bind you, and to step into the freedom that only Christ can give. This playlist is filled with powerful messages that are designed to speak to your heart and give you the strength to continue on your path of healing and growth. So, after this video, don't go anywhere. Click the link to the playlist and dive deeper into the teachings, the stories, and the hope that's waiting for you. As you watch, I want you to take a moment to reflect on your own life. Where are you struggling? What do you need to let go of in order to walk in the freedom and peace that God has promised you? Know that you are not alone in this journey. There is a community of people here, just like you, who are seeking God's strength and grace to overcome their struggles. We are in this together, and I'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments below what you thought of Andrew's story and how you found encouragement in this message. Have you ever faced a similar battle, or are you currently in the midst of your own struggle? What steps are you taking to find freedom and healing in your own life? Your comments might be the encouragement someone else needs to hear today. If you haven't yet, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you're not just getting access to more videos, you're joining a community that's committed to supporting each other in our spiritual journeys. We're all in this together, and every step you take toward healing and transformation is a victory not just for you, but for everyone who is watching and learning with you. Thank you so much for being here and for being a part of this journey. I know it's not always easy, but the good news is, you don't have to do it alone. With God's strength, the support of others, and your own commitment to growth, there is nothing that can hold you back from living the life God has called you to live. So, let's walk this path together. Let's continue to support one another, to share our stories, and to lift each other up. Now click the link, watch the playlist, and let's continue this journey of transformation and healing. God bless you all, and I'll see you in the next video. Don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. I can't wait to hear from you.